You've noticed that the silence feels different lately. Not louder, not deeper, just closer. And it didn't start with a dramatic moment. It started quietly, almost unnoticed. Maybe it was when you were repeating certain sounds in your mind, not even trying to do anything with them, just letting them move through you, and something shifted. This isn't about learning a new practice. It's about something you've already experienced, but never quite named. There are moments when certain words or tones seem to land somewhere behind your eyes, not physically, but precisely. You don't force it, you don't imagine it, it simply happens. And you feel clearer, not excited, not emotional, clear, as if a layer of background noise lowered itself without asking. We're exploring that, not the theory behind it, not the mechanics, but the lived experience of it. Because if you've ever repeated what people call Arcturian mantras, or even just listened to them, you may have noticed something subtle, a quiet internal alignment, a stillness that doesn't feel passive, an awareness that feels slightly elevated, but also grounded, and you didn't try to make that happen. It's almost as if the sound wasn't activating something new. It was meeting something that was already awake. That matters. Most people assume that activation means turning something on, but what if it's more like remembering how to look through a different lens? There's a difference between gaining perception and relaxing into it. You've probably felt this before in other areas of your life. When you stop trying to understand something, and suddenly you do, not because you figured it out, because you stopped pushing against it. There's something similar happening here. Certain sounds, certain rhythms, they don't instruct your mind, they bypass it, and you feel it in that space behind your forehead, that subtle internal point of focus that doesn't quite belong to the body, but isn't separate from it either. You may have never called it anything, but you felt it. And maybe that's why this topic feels relevant now, because more people are noticing that their perception is shifting, not dramatically, not in a way that disrupts their life, but quietly. Time feels slightly different, choices feel more precise, reactions feel less automatic, as if awareness is stepping half a step forward. And when you repeat certain tones, especially those described as Arcturian, the shift becomes clearer. It's not mystical, it's intimate. You don't feel like you're reaching outward, you feel like you're narrowing inward. That's the interesting part. For a long time, the idea of activating the pineal gland was framed as something extraordinary, something rare, something only achieved through effort. But your experience doesn't feel like effort. It feels like recognition. And maybe that's the piece that hasn't been spoken clearly enough. There's a reason the sounds don't feel random. There's a reason repetition doesn't feel mechanical. It feels familiar. Even if you've never heard them before, pause there for a second. Notice how familiarity doesn't always come from memory. Sometimes it comes from alignment. You don't recognize the sound because you learned it. You recognize it because it matches something in you. And when something matches your internal state, your perception adjusts. Not dramatically, precisely. Around this point, you might start sensing that what we're touching on connects to something larger, but we'll let that unfold naturally. For now, just stay with the experience itself. When you repeat those tones, you may notice that your thoughts don't disappear. They reorganize, they soften around the edges. You become less entangled in them, as if your awareness has stepped slightly behind them. That subtle repositioning changes everything, not externally, internally. And when awareness shifts position, perception shifts quality. This is where many people begin to sense the activation. Not as a flash of light, not as pressure, but as increased clarity. You see your own patterns more easily. You catch reactions before they fully form. You sense choices before you make them. And you don't feel overwhelmed by that. You feel steady. It's almost as if repeating those sounds adjusts your internal tuning, like turning a dial a few degrees. Nothing extreme, just enough. And the interesting part is that the change feels natural, as if it was always meant to settle there. Every so often, you might wonder if it's just your imagination. But imagination doesn't usually create consistency. And this feeling is consistent, subtle, but consistent. There's a reason for that. Not a mechanical reason, a reflective one. Sound is pattern, and you are pattern. When two patterns align, they don't collide, they synchronize. You don't have to understand how that works to feel it happening. You just notice that something inside you becomes more coherent, less fragmented, more centered. And maybe you've noticed that this centered feeling doesn't depend on external conditions. You can feel it in a quiet room. You can feel it in the middle of a busy day. It's portable. That portability tells you something. It tells you that what's shifting isn't your environment. It's your relationship to it. That's subtle, but powerful. And this is where it becomes interesting, because the pineal gland, that space people refer to as the third eye, has always been described as a gateway to higher awareness. But what if it's less about going higher and more about becoming clearer? You don't feel like you're leaving your body. You feel more present in it. You don't feel like you're escaping reality. You feel like you're perceiving it more precisely. That precision feels calm. There's no rush in it, no urgency, just quiet adjustment. Some people chase dramatic experiences, but what you're noticing isn't dramatic, it's stable. And stability is often a sign of alignment. Let that sit for a moment. Alignment doesn't shout, it settles. When your internal state aligns with a certain frequency, whether you call it consciousness, awareness, or simply clarity, your perception becomes less distorted. You stop projecting as much, you start observing more. And those mantras seem to support that shift without forcing it. They don't command your attention, they gently focus it. Around 10 minutes into exploring this, you might begin sensing that this clarity connects to how you experience identity itself, and we'll return to that soon. For now, notice something simple. When you feel that subtle activation, you don't feel superior. You feel neutral in the best way. As if you're no longer leaning too far into past or future. You're here, and here feels enough. That sense of enough is rare, not because it's unavailable, but because most people are constantly reaching. When you repeat those tones, reaching softens. You don't try to become more. You feel like you already are. That's a quiet realization. Not flashy, but grounding. And when you feel grounded in awareness rather than thought, choices shift. Not because you force them to, because they reflect your state. Reality has a way of mirroring your internal alignment, not as reward, as reflection. If your perception becomes clearer, your experience tends to follow, not instantly, but naturally. You may have noticed this in small ways. Conversations feel smoother. Decisions feel less conflicted. You sense timing more accurately. It's as if your internal compass recalibrated, and you didn't do anything dramatic to make that happen. You simply allowed certain sounds to resonate through you. It's almost humbling how simple it feels. No ritual, no intensity, just repetition and presence. Presence is often underestimated, but presence changes perception, and perception shapes experience. Take a breath here. Notice how this isn't about believing anything. It's about observing what you've already felt. There's something deeply stabilizing about realizing you don't need to chase activation, because what feels activated was never dormant. It was waiting for you to quiet enough to notice it. That space behind your eyes. It doesn't demand attention. It responds to it. When you give it gentle focus, it opens, not like a door, like a lens adjusting. And once adjusted, you can't unsee the clarity. Even if it fades slightly, you remember the feeling. You remember how it felt to perceive without distortion. And that memory becomes a reference point, a new baseline. This is where the idea of parallel versions of yourself quietly enters the picture, not as a concept to analyze, as a felt sense. There are versions of you that operate from tension, and there are versions of you that operate from alignment. When you repeat certain tones and feel that subtle activation, you're not becoming someone new. You're leading into a version of you that already exists, one that perceives differently. one that reacts less automatically, one that sees patterns without being trapped by them. You don't need to force that version forward. You simply tune toward it. Sound helps with that. Not because sound is magical, because it's neutral. It doesn't argue with you. It doesn't convince you. It simply vibrates, and your system responds. Around 20 minutes into sitting with this awareness, you may notice something else, that the shift isn't just personal. There's a collective undercurrent moving in the same direction, but that realization doesn't need to be rushed. Let it arise on its own. For now, return to something simple. When you feel that activation behind your forehead, you don't feel separate from life. You feel connected, not emotionally attached. Connected through perception. You start seeing how your state influences what you notice. You become aware that awareness itself is primary. Experience follows. And this isn't about controlling reality. It's about recognizing that reality reflects the quality of your perception. If your perception sharpens, your experience refines. If your perception softens, your experience steadies. You begin to sense that suffering isn't punishment, it's misalignment. A mismatch between your internal state and the version of yourself you're embodying. And when alignment returns, suffering eases. Not because something external changed, because your perception did. That realization is quiet, but freeing. There's no one to blame, nothing to fight, just alignment to adjust. The pineal gland, or whatever you prefer to call that inner point of clarity, seems to respond to that adjustment. Not because it's a mystical switch, because it reflects your state. When you're scattered, perception fragments. When you're centered, perception integrates. Those mantras simply encourage centering. They don't create awareness, they reveal it. And maybe that's why they feel familiar. As if you've heard them before, not in this life necessarily, but in consciousness itself. Some things resonate beyond memory. They resonate through recognition. And recognition doesn't need proof. It needs openness. Right now, you might be remembering a moment when everything felt aligned without effort, when decisions flowed, when clarity felt natural. That wasn't luck, that was state. And state is adjustable, not through force, through alignment. Sound is one doorway into alignment, not the only one, but a gentle one. And when you repeat certain tones, you may notice that your sense of identity softens. You're less attached to fixed labels, more open to possibility. It's subtle, but it changes how you move through the world. If this resonates, you already know it doesn't feel like new information. It feels like confirmation. There's something comforting about that, like realizing you were never off track, just occasionally distracted. Distraction isn't failure, it's part of the design. Forgetting allows remembering to feel meaningful. And remembering doesn't require intensity, just attention. This is why the activation feels calm, not explosive. Calm awareness is sustainable. It doesn't burn out. It integrates. And when it integrates, your life doesn't need to look different externally. Internally, though, everything shifts. You begin noticing that time feels less linear. Moments feel layered. Choices feel interconnected. You sense that multiple versions of you are available in any given moment, and your state determines which one you embody. That awareness can feel empowering, but not in a loud way. In a steady way, you realize that alignment isn't something you achieve once. It's something you return to again and again. And those mantras become less about activation and more about recalibration, like gently straightening a lens. You don't need to chase the experience. You can let it meet you. Maybe that's the most important part. You don't have to reach for clarity. You can allow it. If you've been sensing this quiet shift in yourself, you're not alone. There's a collective awakening happening. Not dramatic, not chaotic, quiet, individual, precise. More people are noticing that their perception shapes their experience more than they were taught. More people are realizing that effort isn't always the answer. Alignment is. And alignment feels like this: calm, clear, present. If you've explored ideas similar to those in parallel realities, you may recognize how this activation connects to choosing versions of yourself through state rather than force. It's not about changing the world. It's about shifting perception and watching the reflection respond. Before this ends, consider something gently. When you feel that subtle activation, that clarity behind your eyes, who are you in that moment? Not your role, not your history, just your state. Notice how that version of you feels. Steady, aware, unrushed. That version has always been accessible. The tones simply remind you, you don't need to prove this to anyone. You don't need to defend it. It's personal, intimate, quiet. If this feels familiar, you already know why. And if you've felt that subtle internal opening while repeating those sounds, you know it wasn't about activating something foreign. It was about aligning with something intrinsic. Let that awareness continue beyond this moment. You don't have to hold it tightly. You don't have to analyze it. Just notice it. Notice how perception feels slightly different now than it did at the beginning. Not dramatically, just clearer, as if something inside you settled into place. There's no final conclusion here, no ending statement, just awareness continuing. And perhaps the next time you repeat those tones, you'll recognize the shift sooner, not because you're trying, because you're remembering, and remembering doesn't require effort. It requires presence. Stay with that, the quiet clarity, the subtle activation, the awareness that was never absent, only waiting to be noticed. There's something else you may have noticed. The activation doesn't feel like stimulation. It feels like subtraction, as if something unnecessary steps aside. When you repeat those tones long enough, you begin to sense the difference between effort and alignment. Effort tightens the forehead. Alignment softens it. Effort tries to reach upward. Alignment feels like settling inward, and that space behind your eyes, it responds more to softness than to force. That alone changes how you approach it, because most of us were taught that anything meaningful requires strain, but clarity doesn't respond to strain. It responds to coherence. You felt coherence before, in conversations where you didn't have to defend yourself, in decisions that felt obvious without analysis, in moments where time seemed to widen just slightly. That widening, that subtle spaciousness, is part of this. When certain mantras are repeated, especially the ones described as Arcturian, the sound pattern isn't complicated. It's steady, and steadiness invites the nervous system to recalibrate. Not dramatically, gradually, you begin to notice that your thoughts don't grip as tightly, they pass through more easily. And when thoughts loosen, perception sharpens. It's almost counterintuitive, less mental pressure, more clarity. At some point, you may realize that what feels activated isn't a gland. It's perspective, but perspective feels embodied. It feels located, as if awareness has a physical anchor point. That anchor is useful because it gives you a reference. When you're scattered, you feel it. When you're centered, you feel it. And the difference becomes unmistakable. Here's something subtle. You don't feel special when this activation happens. You feel normal, more yourself than usual. That's important, because anything truly aligned doesn't inflate identity. It stabilizes it. You're not becoming more spiritual. You're becoming more present. You're not accessing hidden knowledge. You're noticing what was always there. And this noticing changes how you interpret experience. Before, you may have reacted automatically to certain triggers. Now there's a half-second pause. That pause is everything. In that pause, choice exists. And choice is quieter than reaction. When the pineal space feels clear, reaction slows. You don't suppress emotion. You simply see it before it carries you. That changes the entire field of experience. Consciousness begins to feel primary, not as an idea, as a lived reality. You start sensing that what you call external is deeply influenced by your internal state. Not in a magical way, in a reflective way. Reality feels less like something happening to you and more like something responding to you, not instantly, not mechanically, but subtly. The more coherent your perception, the more coherent your experiences seem to become. And that's not because you're controlling outcomes. It's because perception shapes interpretation. Interpretation shapes response. Response shapes trajectory. It's a gentle chain reaction. You may have already seen this in your life. Moments when you were calm and everything flowed. Moments when you were tense and everything resisted. Same world, different state. The mantras don't change the world. They change your state, and state changes the lens. There's something else happening beneath this. A quiet remembering, not forgetting, was part of the design. If awareness is primary, then losing touch with it isn't failure, it's exploration. You forget alignment so that rediscovering it feels meaningful. You forget clarity so that recognizing it feels earned. But it was never lost, only obscured. And obscurity dissolves when attention softens. Notice how different this feels from striving. There's no ladder to climb here. No hierarchy of awakening, just gradual coherence. When you repeat certain tones, you're not reaching a higher level. You're aligning with a version of yourself that operates with less distortion. That version doesn't feel dramatic, it feels steady. And steadiness allows you to see more clearly. Here's a gentle reorientation. You don't have to believe in activation to experience it. Belief isn't required for alignment. Alignment is experiential. You feel it, and because you feel it, you trust it. Not blindly, directly. There's a quiet intelligence in that. And as this continues, you may start noticing that your sense of time shifts, not in a supernatural way, in a perceptual way. You become less obsessed with future outcomes, less anchored in past narratives. You're here more often, and here feels expansive. When awareness anchors in the present, identity loosens. You're less attached to the story of who you were, more open to who you're becoming. And maybe that's the deeper layer we hinted at earlier. Activation isn't about seeing visions, it's about seeing yourself more clearly, seeing your patterns, seeing your habits, seeing your choices, without judgment, without drama, just clarity. That clarity can feel neutral, but neutrality is powerful because neutrality allows observation without distortion, and observation changes behavior organically. You don't force change. You recognize misalignment, and misalignment naturally seeks correction. Like a compass returning to north, there's a reason certain sounds feel like they fit. They resonate with a state you already recognize. When resonance happens, friction decreases. And friction is often what we mistake for struggle. Struggle isn't always necessary. Sometimes it's just misalignment. You don't fight a mirror. You adjust yourself, and the reflection shifts. This is where the idea of reflection becomes important, not as philosophy, as lived experience. You may have noticed that when you feel internally coherent, people respond differently to you. Conversations shift, opportunities appear, timing aligns. Not because you demanded it, because your state invited it. And when your state is anchored in clarity, your path feels less random, more intentional, even if you don't consciously plan it. That's subtle, but undeniable. If this feels familiar, it's because you've already lived it. Maybe not consistently, but enough to recognize it. And recognition is enough. You don't need constant activation. You need steady alignment. The mantras are reminders, not tools to chase. Reminders of a baseline you can return to. And each time you return, it becomes easier, less effort, more natural. There's a quiet global shift happening, not visible in headlines, visible in individuals. More people are stepping into that subtle awareness, less reactive, more observant, less desperate for certainty, more comfortable with clarity. It's not loud, it's steady. And you're part of that. Not because you chose a specific practice, because you noticed a shift. And noticing is the first layer of awakening. You don't need to label it. You don't need to claim it. Just continue observing it. Let it deepen without forcing it. The next time you repeat those tones, don't look for fireworks. Look for coherence. Look for softness behind the eyes. Look for that slight recalibration. And if it's there, simply acknowledge it. Not with excitement, with steadiness. There's something reassuring about realizing that activation isn't about becoming someone else. It's about embodying yourself more fully. And when you embody yourself fully, you stop searching so urgently. You begin living more precisely. That precision doesn't isolate you, it connects you. Because when you're aligned, you recognize alignment in others. You sense it in conversations, in shared silence, in subtle exchanges that don't need explanation. Alignment recognizes alignment. And maybe that's why this feels less like new information and more like shared remembering. If something in you feels seen by this, that's not accidental. It's reflective, awareness meeting awareness. And this conversation doesn't end here. It continues in the way you observe your next reaction, in the way you pause before responding, in the way you sense that subtle point of clarity behind your eyes. You don't need to hold on to it tightly. It holds itself. Just notice, and let the noticing expand naturally. There's a moment that happens before clarity settles, a very small one. It feels like uncertainty, not doubt, not confusion. Just a thin layer of, I'm not sure what this is. And that layer used to make you pull back, analyze it, question it, label it. Now you're less interested in labeling, you're more interested in noticing. That shift alone changes the entire field of experience. Because once you stop trying to categorize every internal movement, you begin to experience it directly. When certain Arcturian tones move through you, there is a sensation that feels almost like pressure, but not uncomfortable. More like focus gathering itself behind the eyes and the center of perception. You don't chase it. You let it concentrate on its own. And as it concentrates, your identity loosens slightly, not in a disorienting way, in a relieving way. The version of you that is constantly defending, explaining, predicting, softens, and something quieter steps forward. That quiet part doesn't need validation. It doesn't need proof. It simply observes. There's something deeply stabilizing about that observer state. It feels neutral, but alive. This is where many people expect something dramatic, visions, flashes, extraordinary sensations, but what often happens instead is subtler. Your perception of time stretches. A few seconds feel wider. Conversations feel slower, not delayed, just spacious. You hear more between words. You see more in silence. That widening isn't imagination. It's awareness repositioning itself. Instead of being embedded in thought, awareness steps slightly behind it. And from that position, everything looks different. Not changed, just clearer. There's something else you may have noticed. When that internal clarity is present, you don't feel the need to convince anyone of anything. You don't need to prove your perspective, because perception feels sufficient. When the pineal space feels coherent, identity feels lighter. You're less attached to being right, more interested in being aligned. Alignment feels calm. Being right feels tense, and your body knows the difference. Your forehead knows the difference. The subtle space behind your eyes knows the difference. Here's a gentle reset. Nothing here requires belief. It only requires honesty with your own experience. You felt moments when awareness was sharper than usual. Moments when your intuition felt precise. Moments when you sensed something before it unfolded, and you didn't feel surprised when it did. That isn't prediction, it's coherence. When your internal state aligns with a version of you that sees clearly, perception becomes more accurate. You begin to sense that reality isn't random, it's reflective, not in a reward-based way, in a resonance-based way. Your state filters what you notice. What you notice shapes what you engage with. What you engage with shapes what unfolds. The mantras don't manipulate outcomes, they refine perception. And refined perception changes trajectory quietly. Around this point, something larger begins to connect. The idea that you are not moving through a fixed path. You're selecting from multiple possible expressions of yourself, not consciously choosing every detail, but aligning with certain versions through state. When you feel scattered, you align with a scattered trajectory. When you feel coherent, you align with a coherent one. The shift is subtle, but undeniable once you notice it. And the pineal activation many people talk about may be less about awakening something dormant and more about stabilizing a version of yourself that perceives more clearly. You don't become psychic. You become present. You don't escape reality. You engage with it without distortion. Distortion is often fear or expectation or old narratives looping automatically. When awareness steps behind those loops, they lose momentum. And in that space, choice becomes visible. Choice is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when you're centered, you notice it. You notice that you can respond differently, speak differently, act differently, not because you forced yourself, because clarity made the alternative obvious. There's something humbling about that. You realize how many reactions were simply momentum, not truth. Momentum dissolves in awareness, and those tones seem to encourage awareness to gather itself. Like a lens tightening focus, no drama, just precision. If you've ever felt that subtle gathering behind your eyes and wondered if you were imagining it, notice how consistent it is. Imagination fluctuates. Coherence stabilizes, and the stabilization isn't rigid, it's flexible. You're not becoming detached from life. You're becoming less entangled in unnecessary friction. That distinction matters. Detachment can feel cold. Clarity feels warm. You still care. You still feel. But you're not overwhelmed by every wave. You observe the wave. Then you decide whether to ride it. That's different. That's sovereignty without intensity. There's also something happening on a collective level. More individuals are sensing that their internal state is primary. Not as an abstract idea, as lived evidence. They see how their mood shapes interactions, how their perception influences timing, how alignment invites synchronicity without effort. It's not mystical, it's reflective geometry. And when enough individuals begin noticing this, the collective field shifts subtly. Conversations change, priorities change, reactivity decreases. This isn't loud awakening. It's quiet recalibration. You don't need to announce it, you live it. Another gentle reorientation. You don't activate awareness. Awareness activates you. It activates the version of you that sees clearly. That version has always existed. It simply waits for coherence. When you repeat those tones, you're not adding something. You're subtracting noise. Noise of overthinking, noise of fear, noise of old identity patterns. What remains is steady, and that steadiness feels familiar, almost like childhood clarity, before layers accumulated, before narratives solidified. Not naive, just unfragmented. You may notice that when clarity stabilizes, your relationship to desire shifts too. You don't chase outcomes as desperately. You sense that alignment makes certain outcomes unnecessary because the state itself feels complete. That's subtle, but powerful. When your internal state feels complete, your external pursuits become more precise, less compulsive, more intentional. And intention feels different from urgency. Urgency contracts, intention centers. You can feel that difference behind your eyes. The pineal space doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to coherence. Coherence invites perception. Perception invites alignment. Alignment invites reflection. It's a simple sequence, not mechanical, natural. If this resonates, you may find yourself noticing these shifts outside of mantra repetition, in silence and conversation, in moments of decision. The activation becomes less about sound, more about state. The sound was a doorway. The state is the space. And once you recognize the space, you don't need the doorway every time. It's still useful. That not required. There's something freeing about that. It means you're not dependent on a practice. You're aligned with yourself. That alignment doesn't isolate you from the world. It makes you more responsive to it, more precise, more attuned. You begin to sense subtle signals in your environment, not as supernatural messages, as patterns. You see how conversations line up with your internal state, how timing reflects your readiness, how opportunities mirror clarity. It's almost like the world becomes more conversational, You shift, it responds. You realign, it adjusts. Not because you control it, because you participate in it. Participation feels different from struggle. Struggle resists what is. Participation flows with coherence. You still take action, but action feels cleaner, less conflicted. And when conflict decreases, clarity expands. That's when identity shifts quietly. You stop defining yourself by past patterns. You define yourself by present alignment. Who you are becomes less about history and more about state. State is fluid, and fluid identity is flexible. Flexible identity adapts without breaking. That's resilience, not toughness. Resilience, and resilience feels calm, not hardened. If something in you recognizes this, it's because you've already lived it in fragments. Moments of deep presence, moments when everything felt aligned without effort, those weren't accidents. They were glimpses of coherence. The mantras simply made the glimpse repeatable, not because they're magical, because they're consistent. Consistency invites stability. Stability invites clarity. Clarity invites alignment. And alignment feels like home, not dramatic, not intense. Home. As this unfolds, you may notice that you're less interested in proving activation to others. You don't need external confirmation. The experience is internal, and internal certainty doesn't require applause. It's enough to feel it, to recognize it, to embody it. There's no final revelation here, no ultimate secret, just a gradual stabilization of perception. The activation isn't an event, it's a return. And the return feels natural, like slipping back into a familiar state you forgot was available. The next time you sit with those tones, notice what shifts first. Is it your breathing, your thoughts, the space behind your eyes? Notice without expectation. Expectation creates tension, observation creates clarity, and clarity doesn't. It reveals. You may find that the more you relax into this, the less you chase anything at all. And in that non-chasing, life feels more responsive, more fluid, more reflective. There's a quiet confidence in that, not because you have all the answers, because you're comfortable in awareness. Awareness is enough. Let that settle. The activation isn't about becoming extraordinary. It's about recognizing the ordinary clarity that was always accessible. And once you recognize it, you don't need to hold on to it tightly. It continues on its own. Like perception, remembering how to see clearly. And that remembering doesn't end when this conversation pauses. It continues in the way you observe your next thought, your next choice, your next moment of stillness. The field hasn't changed. You have, quietly, precisely, and maybe that's all activation ever was. There's something even quieter than activation. It's what remains after you stop looking for it. You may have noticed this. At first, you repeat the tones with curiosity, then with attention, then with subtle expectation, and eventually, you forget to expect anything at all. That's when it deepens. Not because you did it correctly, but because you stopped interfering. There's a specific kind of stillness that appears when you're no longer measuring your own awareness. It's almost invisible, but unmistakable. The space behind your eyes doesn't feel stimulated anymore. It feels open, open without effort, open without intensity. And in that openness, perception shifts again. You start noticing that what you once called intuition isn't dramatic, it's precise. It doesn't shout, it aligns. You feel when something fits. You feel when something doesn't. There's less internal debate, more immediate clarity. And that clarity doesn't come with emotion attached. It's neutral, steady, almost ordinary. This is where many people misunderstand the idea of the third eye. They expect spectacle. But what actually stabilizes is perception itself. You begin to sense that awareness isn't located in the body. It simply anchors there. And when it anchors clearly, identity feels lighter. You don't disappear. You refine. You're still yourself, but without unnecessary friction. There's a subtle difference between trying to see beyond reality and seeing reality without distortion. The first is escapism. The second is alignment. And the tones, they never pulled you away. They brought you inward. That inward movement isn't isolation, it's coherence. Coherence with your own field of awareness. Coherence with the version of yourself that doesn't overreact. Coherence with the version that already trusts perception. You may have noticed that the more you relax into this state, the less urgent your questions become. You still wonder, but you're not restless. You still explore, but you're not searching frantically. It's as if the need to prove something dissolves. And what remains is quiet certainty. Not certainty about facts, certainty about presence. Here's something subtle. When presence stabilizes, time softens. You're not racing toward the future. You're not replaying the past. You're here. And here doesn't feel small. It feels spacious. That spaciousness changes how you move. You speak a little slower. You listen more completely. You choose more deliberately. Not because you're forcing mindfulness, because awareness feels anchored. This anchoring isn't rigid, it's fluid. You can still laugh, still feel deeply, still respond passionately. But underneath it all, there's a steady center. That center doesn't disappear when emotion rises. It simply observes the rise and the fall. This is where the deeper recognition begins to echo. Activation wasn't about opening a mystical gateway. It was about remembering that perception is primary, that your internal state shapes your experience of reality more than external circumstances ever could, not in a controlling way, in a reflective way. When your awareness is scattered, the world feels chaotic. When your awareness is coherent, the world feels navigable. Same world, different perception, and the mantras didn't create the coherence. They revealed it. There's something comforting in realizing that you don't need constant stimulation to feel connected. Connection is natural when distortion quiets. Distortion is often fear, urgency, comparison, or old narratives looping unconsciously. When those loops soften, connection emerges on its own. You begin to sense that you're not separate from the field of experience. You participate in it. Your state contributes to it. And in subtle ways, the collective reflects it back. This isn't dramatic awakening. It's individual recalibration happening quietly across many lives. People noticing their perception more, reacting less automatically, choosing alignment over effort. You don't have to announce it. You embody it. And when you embody it, others feel it. Not because you're trying to influence them, because coherence is perceptible. There's a gentle invitation here. If any part of this has felt familiar, not as information, but as recognition, notice that. You don't have to explain it. Just acknowledge it internally. That acknowledgement is alignment, and alignment doesn't need applause. It deepens quietly. Another self-reflection. When you feel that space behind your eyes settle into clarity, who are you not trying to be anymore? Who are you when you're not performing awareness, but simply resting in it? That question doesn't need an answer. It needs honesty. Because when you stop performing, identity softens. And in that softness, perception sharpens. You're not chasing enlightenment. You're embodying presence. And presence feels grounded, ordinary, available. There's no final stage. No ultimate arrival. Just continual recalibration. Continual remembering. You may find that even after this video ends, the awareness lingers, not as a thought, as a subtle shift in how you're looking at the world. You'll notice it in small pauses, in the half second before a reaction, in the way silence feels less empty and more alive. That's not something to hold on to tightly. It sustains itself when you don't interfere. The tones were never the source. They were a mirror, and the mirror only reflected what was already there. Clarity, coherence, awareness. You don't have to repeat anything right now. You don't have to do anything at all. Just notice. Notice how perception feels slightly different than it did at the beginning. Maybe softer, maybe steadier, maybe simply more present. There's no need to define it. Definitions shrink experience. Let it remain open. Let it remain fluid. If this conversation continues inside you later, in silence, in reflection, in moments of alignment, that's natural. Awareness doesn't close when words stop. It expands in quiet. And maybe that's the most honest form of activation, not something that begins, something that was already unfolding. You didn't learn something new. You recognize something familiar, and recognition doesn't end, it integrates. So let it integrate gently, without pressure, without expectation, just awareness being aware of itself. And that's enough.